Hello, this is Pick, and welcome back to my developer commentary for Integration by Parts DX presented by FTB. Today's work starts with the material known as antimatter. To produce antimatter, I need an antimatter constructor. This bad boy is very hungry for power. You'll need a lot to produce antimatter at any decent rate. However, I don't need a ton right off the bat. In fact, I have a lot to do today. So I'm just going to let it run off of solar panels while I work on a bunch of other things. This way, any extra antimatter I need for today's projects will already be made. And a real quick handy trick for today is that you could use your cosmetic armor slot to hold onto a spacesuit. Refined storage is going to be a very large focus for today, so to get started I'm going to need the lunar satellite dish. This is a big multi-block, and while you don't need to place it on the moon, I would rather you do so. Of course, I can't stop you, but I think it looks better on the moon and it fits more thematically. So to use this, I'm going to need some power, of course, and I'm just going to let it fill up the buffer with the solar panel. This is one of the few advantages of the masterful machinery ports not consuming per tick, and instead of consuming it all at once, you can get away with stunts like having super low power intake. This multi-block will produce the storage drives for refined storage as well as some other components. One of the possible drops from loopbacks from the dimensional dungeons are these unknown discs. They each provide a special ability and have to be processed through the lunar satellite dish first. Unfortunately, they're not super useful. You can get free flight from one, but it's not exactly the best stuff for this point in the game. Yeah, I kinda wish I could make them better or earlier or something, but it's hard to fit it in. Some stuff of note is being able to teleport through walls, the flight as I just mentioned, and the ability to convert blocks between nether and overworld forms, so if you want ancient debris from Emerald Ore, there's that. The brain of any refined storage network is the controller, and alongside it the muscles that do the operations are the disk drive and the grid. The grid allows you to access any item stored inside your refined storage network, and the disk drive holds disks which hold individual items. You can also use external storages to have items stored on your network. It depends on what you are trying to store and where you want to store it. Applied Energistics, which is another storage mod, limits the number of types of items you can store on a disk, but for refined storage there is no limit, each just has a total number of individual items that can be stored on it. The best way to handle a system like this is to put an external storage on a drawer controller to handle items you have large quantities of, such as raw materials, while using disks on drives for things you don't have a lot of. I'm building a separate facility for this, and it's going to run off of an XNet controller. You might wonder why I'm using XNet to run refined storage. Well, I'm pretty sure it's the only way to make facaded power cables, so because I don't want ugly, that's all I have to use. XNet is a pretty powerful automation tool. To get the basics out of the way, what you do is you make a channel for the type of thing you want to be transmitting. In this case, I'll be transmitting power, so I want a power channel. Then, for each individual thing on the network, I need to decide whether it's going to receive, or gain, or not interact with the network. If I set it to insert, it will insert power into it, and if I set it to extract, it will take power out of it. Of course, I'm going to have to run a separate power network over here, but that isn't that big of a deal. Just know that for any interaction with the network, you're going to need to put a connector on the thing in question. Here are those storage modules in action. The modular storage is actually pretty good for use of external storages because they have a high item capacity. Perhaps the muscle analogy for the disk drive wasn't quite correct. The real muscles of a refined storage system is the crafter. Crafters, as the name implies, do crafting. What kind of crafting? Basically any kind of crafting if something can accept items. Without a block in front of it, a crafter will use patterns inside it to craft items with typical crafting table methods, but with a machine in front of it, it will output to the machine and expect something in return from it. Of course, you'll need to make some patterns, and this requires the pattern grid. The pattern grid allows you to define what a pattern is, and a pattern basically is like a stored crafting recipe. It can handle recipes recursively, so if you need to make an iron block from iron nuggets, it can make them into ingots first, then into blocks. Because they're available, I'll be converting my crafters into iron crafters. These have 27 recipe slots instead of just 9, so you need far less. However, they do consume more power, so make sure you have enough energy to run the system. The first pattern I should make in almost any circumstance is more patterns. And of course after that, more crafters. This is going to be an expandable network, so I'm going to need the bare essentials over and over again. Assuming you have the materials, the system will start crafting if you send in a request. If you don't have the materials, it'll tell you what you're missing, but it won't allow you to start it. If you can make it and still craft the pre-components, of course, it'll craft anyway. Auto-crafting for a machine is very similar to auto-crafting regularly, but as I previously mentioned, it has to be facing a machine. Of course, if the machine has port configuration, you'll need to set it to input from the side the crafter is on, and you'll also need an importer to take the items in from the machine. Importers take from inventories, exporters export to inventories. I fix it by the end of the episode, but the induction smelter is also a special case. It's going to try and export whatever it can to the induction smelter's inventory, so if 2 different recipes require iron, it'll send both the nickel and the red quartz to make both recipes at the same time. It's annoying, but a way around it is to set the crafter to only operate on a redstone pulse. You'll just need an inventory checker to see if the thermal machines are holding any items. I made a personal shrinking device which lets me shrink down to the size of a fifth of a block to fit into cable spaces. Here's the new automation room with lots of thermal machines, some machines from industrial contraptions, the crafting core, and an energizing orb. I'm also going to be setting up some other stuff in just a moment. I need energized health potion next, so I've set up an alchemical imbuer to produce health potion itself, and of course a similar setup to the speed potions. Do make sure you have the oil infrastructure for this. It's quite expensive on empowered and crystallized oil. Now I need a number of centrifugal separators and fluid encapsulators, as well as exporters and importers. This is going to be a mob drop automation setup, similar to the witches with the magical mixture before with that whole distillation tower setup, but without the smeltery component, as this is going to be much easier to do. Through trading with an alien shepherd, I can obtain magical eggs. Throw one at a mob and it'll make a spawn egg out of it. It's pretty easy to do if you summon a mob with nocturnal powder in its given biome, the summoning mechanic on black quartz, or just in this case I found a blaze with a spawner. I'm going to be doing all 4 thermal elementals and witches for my initial batch. The spawn egg then goes into the centrifugal separator, which will create an essence which gets reprocessed and the desired mob fluid. The essence then gets infused with the energized health potion to create another spawn egg. Spawn eggs are a little pricey, so I set up an animal rancher to automatically farm wool. This will let me trade with the shepherd to get more Enderium coins, which lets me trade for magical eggs. I made a dedicated storage room for the fluids my setups are producing. They use containment chalices, which are just used for the aesthetic. I like how they look. External storages are pumped to the bottom to make sure that the system can read them. The requester is a handy device to make sure a certain quantity of desired items are present within your system at a given time. So long as it knows how to craft it, it'll automatically queue up a request to produce it. In this case, glass will send sand to the furnace, and that'll make sure 100 glass stay in the system. Each fluid is then put through an exporter into a casting table to produce its respective drops. Then an external storage is on that drawer which stores each of the things. At this stage, manually refilling my flux capacitor is getting rather tiresome. This is where a player transmitter comes in. If I link it to myself and right-click on an Enderman with it, it becomes a card that can fuel my energy reserves cross-dimensionally. This is going to be very useful in case I want to do a lot of drilling somewhere for some esoteric ore like Desh. Now to look for some oil. Not the same as the oil we got before, this time immersive engineering oil as I can get a lot of it at once. I'm going to need to set up a pump jack as well as use a core sample drill to find an oil reserve. It doesn't take that long for the core sample to take, and once it's done it'll spit out a sample that tells you what it's in that chunk. Every chunk has a different mineral content or lack thereof, as well as a fluid reservoir. In this case I'm looking for an oil reservoir, but I happen to come across a pretty good mineral vein too. This one gives me iron and nickel primarily, and sulfur as a bonus, but that's not really that important. Because I'm running very low on iron, this is actually going to be pretty handy, but before anything I'm going to set up a pump jack, then I'll worry about an excavator. And as soon as I cut, the next vein has oil in it. Why not? I'll at least show off an ability disc. This one is the one that gives flight. It takes some spirit charges to power its flight, but once it does that, it runs for half an hour. It's okay, but the jetpack is still pretty good, and I end up upgrading my jetpack too in this episode, so yeah. The pump jack will mine for oil so long as there's enough supply underneath it. The fluid cell will just store the oil and I'll move it over to the distillation tower manually. I don't have an automated use for oil right now because I have the empowered oil powering the base, but it's still nice to have. Also, to get the oil products from the distillation tower, you can stack several different mechanism tanks and it'll automatically filter it. I could have used this for the magical mixer, but I didn't know that, but this is a pretty handy tip if you want to get that going. Just make sure they're vertically touching and it'll keep filtering them for you, and of course make your output chest for the bitumen that it's going to make. The main product I want from this is the lubricant. It's going to be useful for speed upgrades for my pretty pipes, which will speed up the energizing orb and crafting core processing by a lot. The excavator is a special multi-block from Immersive Engineering. It's capable of mining ores from the underground in those deposits that we found earlier. To make it, it can comprise of two parts, the bucket wheel, which is what scoops the ores out, and the casing, which accepts power, has redstone control, and all that other stuff. So, to make it, you're going to need to right-click on the bucket wheel first, as you have to click on the center of it. Then you place the casing around the outside, and once the casing is complete, the whole structure is. Of course, it'll take a lot of power to run this thing. I think it's like 4096 RF per tick, which is pretty heavy and a lot more than I'm making, but at least it only runs slower if you don't have enough power to run it. So I'm going to be making another generator to have it run faster. With the little power I'm making and have saved, it's actually giving a good amount of ore, but of course it's not going to last like this. I'm going to need to have a lot more power. This beast is called the Industrial Steam Turbine. It produces 1024 RF per tick, and it takes steam as its input as you'd expect. The only way to make steam right now though is a special method. When a blaze is damaged with water, it produces steam. I can then collect this steam with a fluid collector to pump into the turbine. Of course, I'm going to need to heal this blaze so that he lasts forever. I do end up forgetting and he dies, but there's always another one, right? A decoctive diffuser is what will deploy potions to any entities in the area that can accept them. It could be a player, it could be an animal, or it could be a hostile mob like this blaze. It doesn't really matter, and it'll keep deploying the potion over time. The decoctive diffuser also has an upgrade that makes the potion stronger for less duration, but guess what? It's a healing potion. That means it doesn't have a duration, so there's no downside to this. As a side note, if you ever have to deal with a weird fluid that doesn't have a bucket form and you want to export it from your behind storage system, put it in a tank. It'll still be able to read the fluid from the tank and it'll work fine. I put in another fluid collector as well as some speed upgrades in both so they can keep up with steam production. Immersive Engineering has an auto workbench, which means of course you can automate workbench recipes. This means we can make cheaper mechanical components as well as automatic circuit backplanes. I'd like to automate circuit production completely now, so it's going to be very useful to do this. The input and output are dependent on the conveyor directions, and of course you can stop it with redstone if need be. Just remember to set the crafter up so that it's facing into the belt that has the input. Don't you just love watching the crafter do a big project all on its own? Look at all that stuff we don't have to do and can just watch. Yup, I bet none of you have ever watched something be done without doing it yourself. Definitely not right now. A side benefit of antimatter is unstable ingots. They'll decay after a few seconds of crafting them, so you'll have to be quick, but you can make stuff like the healing axe, which will automatically replenish your hunger and saturation when held. You can also make the angel ring for infinite flight, and a number of other useful things. Time to start building on the moon. Much like the oxygen loader, it accepts water and power to create oxygen, except in this case it creates a box in which you can survive without a spacesuit. The infusion altar for the seeds has been replaced with a crafting core. Now it won't mess up at all and it will produce it even quicker. I also fixed the energizing orb automation. Before, if it had different items, it would try to put all the items in it and it wouldn't work, but now it makes sure to only put one recipe in at a time so it'll actually function. There's only one way to truly power an antimatter constructor, and that's a nuclear reactor. This thing is going to craft in the background while I get ready to set it up. The reactor itself has a rather large grid in which you'll put the fuel rods and other components that cool it down. It tells you how much power it's outputting, how much heat it's outputting, and there's even a button to tell you if the reactor will explode or not. It'll also tell you how long the fuel rods will run. Of course, bigger fuel rods will generate more power, but also produce more heat. You can't use uranium in its raw form for nuclear fuel, you have to process it into uraninite. This takes energized glowstone, which of course I'm making from the magical mixture distillation. A lot of the other reactor components are handed out in the quest book, at least for your starter reactor, or just one. As you can see, the total lifespan of the reactor is dependent on how cool it gets. Of course you don't want it to explode, it's going to be a pretty big explosion, it even tells you how big it's going to be. But to cool it down you need heat vents. The better the heat vent, of course, the more heat will be dissipated. You also want to increase the heat by using neutron reflectors. This allows each fuel rod to produce much more power than it would otherwise, but you need to be wary of the extra heat it produces. This design is a 100% safe, stable design that I'm going to be using, so I don't have to worry about it overheating. Here's the finished product. While expensive, it is capable of producing 480 zavs per tick, which is equivalent to 4 times that in RF. It's a lot of power, and you can even use it to power your RF machines if you'd like, but I'm using it exclusively for antimatter. This base has also provided energy from solar panels, which does most of the processing stuff that I'll be doing alongside the antimatter. If you want even more mileage out of your nuclear energy, a bunch of reprocessors will produce scrap, which will get put into the antimatter constructor to make antimatter even faster. It will also take much less energy. A block duplicator is good as it takes any item to produce a scrap, so something with high crafting rate like the block duplicator's block output, you'll be good to go. I switched from Tyrian to stone because I'll be using stone here anyway. And if you really want some speed, craft the scrap into scrap boxes. It has an extra efficiency bonus on it. Now to set up the mana death generator. This is using blazing blood, glacial blood, and liquid ender as fuel, and it produces mana. It's automatically receiving it from the exporter, and it doesn't have any of the caveats Botania flowers usually are accompanied by. Its generation rate is also decently quick, as it's filling up a Gaia spreader fast enough to have almost consistent shooting. I think it'll be very important to have a lot of mana, especially when I want to automate ore processing, and it has the benefit of faster terra steel, as well as free use of the mana enchanter. The last project of this episode is going to require a lot of dye. This means I'm going to automate it by using a Jaded Amaranthus. The Jaded Amaranthus produces mystical flowers as long as it's provided with mana. Of course, you'll have to harvest them, so I'm going to borrow the Drum of the Wild from before when we were harvesting wheat. I can then set a redstone timer using a hovering hourglass for 2 minutes, and every 2 minutes it'll harvest the fields only to be collected by an ender hopper. Since I have a lot of varied inputs that'll have the same recipe shape, the crafty crate is perfect for this job. It will turn the mystical flowers into mystical petals. That'll then get sent into an ender chest. I started with logistical sorters, but after a lot of fiddling I decided item routing nodes were the best way to go. From the ender chest, things are sent into a macerator, and then once the petals are macerated they become dyes. The best way to process ancient debris is to put it in the alchemy table with some cutting fluid. You'll get 2 netherite dust per ore, which means you'll get 2 netherite ingots from 1 ancient debris, as opposed to needing 4 ancient debris to make 1 netherite ingot as the regular recipe. I definitely want computer access in space, so to use a network transmitter, all you have to do is place a network card in it with the coordinates of the receiver that you want to send it to. It works cross-dimensionally, so I can just use the network card to access the computer from space. It's not too expensive, so I definitely recommend it if you want to transport your refined storage network cross-dimensionally. A simple combination of a precise dropper and crafter will automatically get those high energy ores being processed. I'm then going to send it through an ender chest into space. Ender chests and ender tanks are pretty easy to make now, and it's very useful when you have different bases in different dimensions. So this is the new space base. Of course I have plenty of oxygen being produced, but to go over the automation for ore processing, I have a compressor and a powered furnace that are accepting which are the other end of that ender chest on the ground. That gets sent right into the system. Then of course I have the macerator setup, which I previously showed, and this precise dropper setup. So basically what this dropper does is every time it receives a crafting input, it's going to send a signal to the crafter, and the pretty pipe sort each of the drops so that everything gets into the crystallized oil. Then the remaining ores are picked up from the vacuumulator, and the inventory checker, which replaces the comparator, and soon to be an inventory checker instead of a comparator, is going to read the inside of the vacuumulator to send another pulse to the crafter. Unfortunately, thermal machines don't seem to be compatible with comparators, but inventory checkers are, so it all works out in the end. All that ore then gets sent to the drawers, which are essentially a part of the storage network. Now I decided to not use pretty pipes and just put it into the storage directly so that it tells that it got an ore. The ore processing compact machine has also been upgraded to be able to handle the gem and dust type ores. Of course, now it's in the space station as well, so that all the ore processing is in one centralized location. A note that I should say is don't use pretty pipes with the alchemy table. It seems to cause crashes and not work, so that's just a fair warning. This is that trick in action with the induction smelter, by the way. The crafter is redstone responsive, so it'll only do one craft at a time. Okay, so after an absolute ton of fiddling, and I mean like a lot of fiddling, I finally found a way to automatically make and process the ores. It relies on the crafter, of course, that's making the ores, and the requester, which requests the number of ores, which is dependent on if the system has the number of ingots in it that I need. The detectors detect if there's an amount of ingots or dust in the system that's sufficient, and if it's under that limit, it activates a redstone signal, which activates the requester, and that requester then requests ores to be produced in the exact amount produced in the recipe. It's very complicated, and I even ran out of crystallized oil, so I can't even demonstrate it properly. But just trust that the system works. If you have a question, ask me, and I can tell you what I did after I figured it out. With ores automated though, that's the end of this episode. So, I thank you for watching. I hope you learned a lot in this one. There was a lot to do. And this has been Pick. I'm glad to have seen you, and I hope to see you again.